Nobody walks into a basement thinking they won't walk out again. But in Swartz Creek, Michigan, in December 2019, one man did, and never returned. It started like any other night. Kevin Bacon, not the actor, didn't show up for Christmas breakfast. And that's where it all started. His parents waited at the table that morning, December 25th, 2019. Plates ready, coffee hot, gifts sitting untouched. But Kevin, their 25-year-old son, never walked through the door. No calls, no texts, just silence. And the longer they waited, the heavier the feeling grew that something wasn't right. Because Kevin wasn't the type of guy who simply disappeared, he was close with his family, especially on Christmas. But by noon, that festive morning had turned cold, and by afternoon, they had to go to the police. What could make a young man vanish overnight without a trace? When police started digging, they quickly learned Kevin had a digital life his family only half knew about. He was openly gay, active on dating apps, and always meeting new people. According to his roommate, Kevin had left the house around 5:23 p.m. on Christmas Eve, all dressed up and excited about a date. Security footage also caught him walking out the front door. Even a few hours later, he sent a casual text. "Gonna be out for a while, inviting more men. Don't wait up." And then, just nothing, no messages, no calls, Kevin simply was gone. So where did he go that night, and who was he meeting? What happened to him in the end? Trust me, if you keep watching till the end, you'll be stepping into a real nightmare. And this is no clickbait, but a serious caution for all the viewers. Kevin Bacon was gone. The authorities only found his car. His clothes were still inside. Yeah, his wallet, his phone, his ID, even his cash. Everything was left untouched. But no Kevin. Earlier that day, Kevin had been living what looked like a normal life. He worked at the local hair salon, did his mom and sister's hair for the holidays, and had a family dinner lined up. But he skipped it, and instead he went back to the place he shared with his friend, pulled out Grindr, and started scrolling. He wasn't looking for a date under the mistletoe, he was looking for a quick escape, maybe something riskier. That's when he found one guy, Kai Lucas. They started chatting, and soon enough Kevin was in his car telling his roommate he'd be back later. But after 6:20 p.m. his phone went off, which was strange. And finally, on December 27th, the police pinged his phone and found it, still inside his car parked on a quiet road in Swartz Creek. And here's where it gets even weirder. The last messages on his phone were to this Kai Lucas. So naturally, the police dug deeper about this new guy. Who was this Kai Lucas? And it turns out that wasn't his real name. And once the cops connected the dots, they realized Kai wasn't just some random guy looking to meet up. He had a trail of police reports, warnings, and men who had met him before. Men who were lucky enough to walk away. Kevin Bacon wasn't the first. But then the question shifts. Why did Kai Lucas lure men to his house? What was happening behind those walls on West Terrell Road, 20 minutes away from Swartz Creek? October 10th, 2019. James Carlson, a 48-year-old guy, found himself in total darkness. Cold cement under him. Something tight clamped around his ankle. Panic set in fast. The last thing he remembered was falling asleep in a car. And now here he was, trapped, disoriented, and completely alone. How did he get there? Why was he chained like some kind of animal? He had no idea. All he had was a butcher knife lying nearby. He grabbed it, sawed through the leather strap digging into his skin, and bolted out of the house as fast as his shaking legs could carry him. He didn't know where he was, somewhere in Detroit maybe, but he knew one thing: he had to get help. When he finally got through to 911, the dispatcher could barely piece together what he was saying. Also, he had nothing much to tell them, apart from the fact that he had traveled all the way from New York to Michigan to meet a man for sex. But instead, he ended up being chained in a basement, cut himself loose luxury, but no clue how he even got there. But here's the strangest part. No charges were filed afterward or no real investigation was started. It was brushed off like some bizarre misunderstanding, and James went back to New York. Case closed. And why did no one seem to care? 6 weeks later, on November 25th of that year, another shock came. A young man was seen sprinting barefoot down a quiet Michigan road, wearing nothing but a leather kilt. And behind him was an older man chasing him like a dog. Seeing this, naturally, the neighbors got terrified and called 911. The young man, panting and terrified, told police he had met the older guy online. He also said that the intimacy between them started consensually with a little role play, which is nothing out of the ordinary. But once inside the man's secluded house, things changed. The older man chained him up in his basement in the name of BDMS and told him he wasn't going anywhere. The young man waited for his chance, ran for his life the moment he could, and never looked back. But who was this horrible guy who kept him chained and later chased him? It was a man named Mark Latunski, the same man from the first incident. When Mark was interrogated, he claimed it was all consensual, just a little BDMF gone wrong. He also said he only chased the guy because he was wearing Mark's expensive $300 leather kilt. Nothing criminal, just a misunderstanding. So police also shrugged it off again as they couldn't find anything solid. And that's how another case also got closed. But neighbors weren't so quick to forget. They remembered the way the young man clung to them, trembling, begging, saying, "Keep him away from me." But unfortunately, the next man didn't get the chance to run. And his name was Kevin Bacon. Kevin was just 25 years old, a bright, vibrant guy from Michigan, well-liked, full of life. As we mentioned earlier, he disappeared after meeting someone on a dating app. His car was found abandoned. His phone was off. His friends and family were frantic. Days later, police traced his last known location. It led them straight back to Mark Latunski's house, but this time they didn't find anyone chained in the basement trying to escape. They found something far worse. The man who opened that door didn't look like a monster. He was calm, polite even. He said his name was Mark Latunski. He even offered the police a tour of his house like he had nothing to hide. He even claimed that he didn't know Kevin, plus he also insisted he's done nothing wrong. When he asked about the chains in his basement, he casually said it was just props. The young man running half naked down the street, a misunderstanding, blown out of proportion, and so on. Here the question is, how does a man go from being a quiet, educated chemist to a scene straight out of a nightmare? Turns out Mark Latunski wasn't always using this original identity of himself. Online, it was him who called himself Kai Lucas. Born in Michigan, 1969, Mark wasn't some backwoods drifter. He was smart, university-educated, worked in labs, knew his way around chemicals. But behind that brilliance was something darker. 4 times in and out of mental institutions, he was diagnosed with major depression, with psychotic features, paranoid schizophrenia, borderline personality traits. But he refused to take his meds. Why? Only he could tell. But that refusal didn't just wreck him, it tore apart everyone around him. In 2001, Mark married a woman named Emily, and they had 4 kids, and with them, Emily tried to build a normal life. But as the years rolled by, the cracks widened. He started to go out of control, and the marriage ended in 2013, custody gone, kids taken away. But it didn't stop there. He once kidnapped his own children. To know about Mark better, the police started by talking to people close to Mark. Friends, colleagues, family. Everyone had something to say, but none of it quite added up. Then they reached out to his ex-wife, Emily. And that's when things took a sharp left turn. Emily dropped a bombshell. Mark had a history of slipping into bizarre theories, deep, paranoid fantasies. For example, at their son's birthday party, out of nowhere, Mark started ranting. There he claimed he wasn't actually his mother's son, but her brother. It wasn't drunken rambling, it was a belief system he lived by. Emily spent years trying to help him, hospital stays, medication, therapy, but nothing stuck. Mark wouldn't let go of the delusions. On the other hand, the police noticed something suspicious in Mark's professional life as well. In Mark's own words, he worked in construction sites and odd jobs, nothing unusual on the surface. But then Mark casually let something slip. He talked about people pretending to employ him, stealing his trust funds, and manipulating him. It got weirder. Mark confessed that he'd been a chemist, an actual qualified chemist with a master's degree, working for top companies for almost 2 decades. But after that, here he was, hopping from one random gig to another, seemingly far beneath his skill set. Why would someone throw away a stable career like that? And then Mark added another piece to the puzzle. He'd been giving massages to men using a fake name. Not a side hustle you'd expect from a man with his background. So why the fake name? Why the massages? Why did a brilliant chemist spiral into such an odd, erratic lifestyle? That's when Emily brought up one more detail, a detail that pushed everything into darker territory. She'd once found messages from men on his computer. She confronted him and he brushed it off, telling her he was just curious. But it was part of the tangled web Mark had spun around himself, a web that kept tightening. So now, overall, detectives had a man who abandoned his career, rejected help, believed he was being hunted, slipped deeper into erratic behavior, and found himself attracted to men for some reason. That's where Jamie Arnold enters. Jamie met Mark in 2016. It was a Grindr match. At first, it seemed like maybe Mark had settled. Jamie thought he'd found someone sweet, caring even. But behind closed doors, there was another side. Deep into the BDSM scene, it got darker than Jamie could handle. And no matter how much Jamie begged, Mark wouldn't take his meds. The control, the unpredictability, the sharp edge of danger. It got too much. Jamie also fled the house one day. But here's the thing, Jamie wasn't the last person to walk into that house, which brings us back to Kevin Bacon. When Kevin disappeared, all eyes turned to Mark. They traced Kevin's messages and followed the trail right to Mark's doorstep. As we said earlier, Mark greeted them cool as ever. The police saw no nervousness, no panic. As the cops walked down to the basement after having a whole home tour, at first glance, nothing seemed out of place. Until they found a partition tucked away, almost as if someone wanted it hidden. They pulled it back, and there, hanging by chains, is a man's naked body. It's Kevin, hanging naked by his ankles, chained to the rafters, and he was dead, stabbed, throat slit, and mutilated. But that's not even the worst part. Mark had already cut off Kevin's testicles. Why? We'd come to that nauseating part very soon. But alongside, he also planned to use Kevin's blood and bones as fertilizer. The reason? As Mark said, Kevin didn't want to suffer and wanted his body to grow flowers for his family. Seriously, this is insane. Not only that, he even ordered a dehydrator because he wanted to make jerky out of Kevin's muscles. The whole thing looked like someone unleashed hell on earth. Immediately, Mark was handcuffed by the police and shoved into the back of the patrol car. But instead of staying quiet, he started rambling. And what he said was even more baffling than the crime scene. First, he casually mentioned a man with an amputated leg who had helped him decorate a palm tree. Then, without warning, he started talking about neighbors poisoning his well with arsenic. He also mentioned something about turning a black-haired, black-eyed boy into a blonde Norwegian. But you see, none of it made any sense, and just when it seemed like he was finished, he dropped another bomb. He claimed the name Mark David Latunski wasn't even his real identity. Rather, he insisted he had been living under a stolen identity since the early 70s. Because, as he claimed, the real Mark Latunski had disappeared decades ago. So now investigators had more questions than ever. Who is this man really? And why did Kevin end up in that basement? What's with the mutilation? And how does a stolen identity connect to any of this? And finally, the most chilling one, was Kevin the only victim? Because when you stand back and look at the precision, the calm, the planning, it starts to feel like Mark Latunski had done this before. But Mark had a totally different take on it. He claimed something shocking, that Kevin himself asked him to do it. Yes, according to Mark, Kevin hadn't just come for a hookup, he'd come to die. And Mark said Kevin wanted his help. Mark told detectives in that Christmas Eve, Kevin walked into the Family Dollar parking lot, calm, smiling, changing clothes in public. He said Kevin made all the choices, turned off his phone, packed his bag, and climbed into Mark's van trunk willingly. But no one could understand why Kevin had gotten into the trunk on his own if he was sober, clear-headed. What did Mark say or feed to make him do that? Though later, Kevin's roommate revealed he'd been spiraling, an overdose, hospital stays, dark obsessions. Maybe he wasn't in the right state of mind. Still, none of these made any sense, and according to Mark, it was all about freedom. Kevin was in control. But the more Mark talked, the more it became clear it was about Mark's control only. Plus, everything Mark said sounded too rehearsed until detectives asked where he left Kevin's keys. Suddenly, Mark's memory faltered. Maybe because that part wasn't rehearsed enough. Mark said Kevin begged to be stabbed, but not just anywhere in his body. He wanted it directly in the spine so he wouldn't feel a thing. But it didn't go as planned. So Mark took it further, slitting Kevin's throat, stringing him up by his ankles with a pulley system, waiting for him to bleed out faster. But Kevin's phone painted a very different story. Texts showed he had serious doubts. He'd asked Mark if he'd be safe after their encounter. He wasn't even looking to die, because why would anyone? Rather, it was the opposite. He was asking for safety. So why was Mark so determined to sell this assisted euthanasia angle? That question opened a much darker door. After Kevin was dead, Mark didn't just leave the body alone. He mutilated it. Specifically, he removed Kevin's testicles. And instead of disposing of them, he carried them to his kitchen. Why? You might want to puke after hearing it, so be ready. Mark told detectives he had a habit. Usually, when there was a new moon, he'd cook Rocky Mountain oysters. And this time, though, he decided to substitute them with Kevin's testicles. As you can see, this is downright cannibalism. Not only eating human flesh on Christmas morning, Mark also texted his ex-husband saying, "I had bacon for dinner last night." At first, no one grasped its meaning. Even Jamie, his husband, thought it was a weird joke. But when it turned out to be true, his lawyers scrambled, claiming Mark was insane, unfit for trial. But then, after months of evaluations, a judge reversed the decision. Mark would face justice. But just when the trial was about to begin, Mark made his boldest move yet. He suddenly pleaded guilty. Against his attorney's advice, without any deal on the table, Mark admitted to everything. The murder, the mutilation, every sickening detail. But why plead guilty after fighting so hard? What was Mark hiding beneath that sudden confession? That answer remains buried with the man who never walked out of that house alive. Basically, he tried to hide the fact that Kevin Bacon wasn't his only victim. Everyone could figure out the fact anyway, because what happened inside those four walls wasn't some impulsive act, not some heated moment gone wrong. This was something colder, sharper, premeditated. Mark Latunski had already made up his mind. He knew exactly what he wanted to do, right down to the weapon. A sword? Too dull. A knife? Perfect. Why? Because the kill wasn't supposed to be messy. It was supposed to be controlled, precise. In October, the court finally sealed his fate. A life in prison with no parole and no second chance. But here's the twist. Even during this trial, nobody bothered to come up with the idea that no way Kevin was the first to run screaming from that house. Even the cops didn't mention that long before the murder, 2 other victims managed to escape who were detained in that basement, drugged and chained, barely making it out alive. They also went straight to the police, telling them exactly what happened. But nobody took them seriously. So why didn't the cops do anything? That's the part that sticks. And then Kevin walked in. By the time the police acted, Kevin was already gone. And suddenly, everyone understood that they acted indeed. But it was too late. Now Mark Latunski sits behind bars right where he should have been long before Kevin ever crossed his path. It feels like justice, but is it really? Because here's the question nobody wants to answer. How many warnings do we need before we stop a killer? And if the police ignore the signs and calls, aren't they also responsible for the next kills? Share your views in the comments below. While this was too gore and full of horror, what you see in this next case will completely blow your mind. In fact, it is arguably the most insane case you will ever hear. Just how far people can go with their manipulation. Subscribe to the channel for more. See you in the next.